Welcome to the Data Center Hawk podcast. I am Mike Netzer, joined as always by David Liggitt, Data Center Hawk founder and president. Today we have a very exciting topic. We have literally rolled up our sleeves to talk about this podcast. So we're going to dive in. We're going to dig in. It's powered land is the topic we're talking about today. Before we get into that, I just want to remind you, data centers are a complex, fast-moving, and dynamic real estate asset class. At Data Center Hawk, we provide deal-backed data globally through our experienced team and our platform to help you make the best decisions around data center real estate. So, David, powered land is a very hot topic. It is extremely hot. In that, I mean that as we've seen over the last several years where data center leasing has shifted more towards a pre-leasing versus a leasing of a built building.
Yes.
That has led to kind of further up the supply chain to land and powered land. So it's really where the big focus of the developers is today. But before we kind of talk about the current state, kind of how do we get here? What did powered land look like? Or just generally data center development, kind of the initial stages where you're getting the land and power. What did that look like 5 to 7 years ago?
Yeah. And we should probably set the spectrum too of like the development spectrum. And I know there's developers out there. I'm simplifying this, but so think if you're new to the space, land, powered shell, turnkey data center. So that's those 4 components. Again, it's oversimplified, but over the last, I would say 2 to 3 years, if you look at that spectrum where we've seen most of the new entrance and investment into the space has been in this part of the market. Now, it's costing more to build data centers, and there's a lot of capital going towards that. I understand that. I'm just saying the opportunity to go out, find land, work to get power brought to that land, and then basically sell the land for more. That's where an opportunity is in the space today. Now, there's some that are doing that and are going to be successful, and some that are doing that and they won't be. And we're going to talk about some of those. But historically, Mike, I took some notes.
I see that.
That's right.
Copious notes,
that's right,
as my dad would say.
Data Center Hawk notebook here. So 2007 to 2014, like land that had these type attributes, which is, at the time it was probably like 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts. That was the type of like long-term growth that some of these sites would see. Maybe there were some larger sites that would be 100 to 200 megawatts, but at the time it was like, hey, that's going to be a 10, 15-year period that we would take that land.
That's plenty. And groups would be like, if we can even ever get it leased, this is like a massive roadmap. That's
right. And this was happening in rural markets. So the states that at the time, again, this is 2007, 2014, that we were seeing this. This is like Oregon, Iowa, Nebraska, rural North Carolina, Washington, Southern Virginia. That's where we were seeing that type of growth. And
these were primarily hyperscale self-builds is what you're referring to.
Yeah. So this is a hyperscale company that would go to these markets. They would say, hey, we need 50 acres, 100 acres, and we're going to need 100 megawatts, 150 megawatts to grow, and they would buy a site, and then they would start that construction, and then potentially in the next 2 to 3 years buy a site next door, and continue to grow that way. And that's where we were seeing the growth. In 2014 to 2020, we really saw a lot of that big growth come back to the bigger cities because cloud availability zones became a much bigger part of the data center development world, and the proximity and latency of those locations became a lot more important. So those the self builds were still happening in these regions, but those bigger availability zones started coming back to the markets like Chicago and Phoenix and Northern Virginia and Atlanta and Dallas in certain ways. And so that shifted the land buying and kind of where you need to land. And we're still talking about like 36 megawatts, 72 megawatts. We're not talking about 400, 500 megawatts like we're seeing today.
And the shift to the kind of core markets or city centers was both the co-location and the hyperscale groups.
Yeah, and typically you would, and actually is one of the reasons that the co-location companies won in that was because they had secured land and power already in these markets. And so when the hyperscale companies came to these markets, they looked around and said, well, there's 3 data center operators that already have a site and they're building on already. So there's a speed to market thing. And it was also them coming into a new market and having to almost like establish their, it's just a speed to market, probably in a pricing thing that allowed them to
get to
move
know
faster.
The land sellers. Probably there's some work to be done there, and just understanding, just getting your arms around a market generally that they had a head start on.
Yeah. So that Now, and so that was happening up to 2020, 2021. What we didn't have on the space yet is this huge power constraint, like across the U.S. So when that hit, all of a sudden it took, your more traditional data center markets, and it started moving the supply around. Powered land, or land, is the new supply in our world. We used to track, back when we started Data Center Hawk like 50 years ago, we used to track basically like, hey, where are the 2 megawatt pockets and the 6 megawatt pockets and the 5, and we still track that. But now it's a much bigger scale and a much, I would say, more holistic approach at kind of like where the future sites are. And so now different states have come into play. So before, when I was reading, it was like Oregon, Iowa, Nebraska, North Carolina, Washington, Southern Virginia. Then now you're seeing New Mexico, Mississippi, Kentucky, Idaho, Pennsylvania, Louisiana. These are all states that have been recipients of data center development projects in the future because there is, power available, and that can be delivered, more quickly than other places. Now, it's going to take a while, and there's other reasons that these markets are attractive besides the power, but the power is the main part.
Yeah, as we've seen, again, the size of these developments grow from, like you said, 36, 72 megawatts. Now it's 500 to a gigawatt.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked to multiple providers at PTC that was like, we're not looking at anything less than 300.
Yeah.
And I think some would say we're not really looking at anything less than 500.
Yes.
Because that's what their customers are asking for them.
That's right.
And so that changes the dynamics of the powered land acquisition.
Yeah.
Both, there's less total sites that even exist like that, and then the actual getting the power to that site is even more challenging when you're asking for a gigawatt from the
and
provider.
the utility, this is historically, again, the utility companies could figure out within reasonable timelines how to, power this land or get the power there, whether it's you're building a substation or you're coming off a transmission line. Whatever the approach was, there was they could meet the established timelines because the constraint wasn't as significant. And there's been a couple of things obviously that have happened that have changed the environment from a demand perspective. And so it's really shifted the approach on supply, which provides the opportunity for, developers, investors, for people to get in the space and try to find opportunities to bring power to land more quickly. Now, that's a very hard thing to do today. I heard a story from someone was making an offer on a land. I think it was like to a site in, it might have been Iowa or Nebraska, can't remember. And they were talking about how it was like a farmer's 200 acre family farm. And they like went to the farmer and brought an offer and thought almost the sense I got was they were almost taking an offer that was like below the market and almost like trying to trick him. Mm-hmm. Like he didn't know, like the farmer didn't understand like what the data center market was, whatever. And I think the farmer or, whoever was looked at the deal and was like, this is like 6 times below what the market is, so it was very clear to that person that the landowners have gotten a lot smarter and they understand what's happening. And so I think if you believe that you're going to go into a market and, kind of like, I think there's some, maybe it's really hard to make a quick buck in the data center space. Maybe that's what I'll say.
Mark that, tweet that.
There we go. Yeah. It's just like, it doesn't operate the same way as an office market or industrial or multifamily. It's just a different world. The deals take longer. It's much more capital, and the world has gotten a lot smarter to the space.
And the diamonds in the rough. There's plenty of groups that have had big land holdings.
Yes.
Some with power secured already. A lot of industrial developers that are looking at their portfolio and going, are these more valuable for data center development than they are for industrial? And again, those opportunities are very rapidly shrinking.
Yeah.
As again, A, groups get smarter, and then B, the sizes is so great that even a pretty significantly sized warehouse might be 50 megawatts. Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of not enough.
Yeah.
These days.
And you got to remember that, like, again, like back when in 2007 and 8 and 9, when I was first getting in space, there's people that have been, honing their expertise over the last 15, 20 years in this specific area. Yeah. So if you are getting into the space for the first time, and if you are trying to like go out and find land and kind of like aggressively go after where, in these corners of the US where maybe data center development hasn't been, I promise you there's other groups that have probably walked that path and looked at those sites. Not saying they're not there, but the diamond in the rough. It's a hard thing to find today. And that's really what you're looking for if you're trying to do it with utility power. Now, there's all this work right now with alternative energy, and we're not going to necessarily go down that path today.
I can't wait for that to be a more real topic, specifically on nuclear, because if you are able to kind of dial up, I don't know what the time frame is to build this. Let's just say it's a year. I don't know. I have no idea if that's right. But if you could kind of order an SMR that gives you 300, 500 gigawatts power and get it in a year,
megawatts,
that changes. That's what I say.
Gigawatts.
I said gigawatt. I meant megawatts.
Yeah, sure.
That is going to very rapidly change. That's a podcast for another day. But it reminds me of this old Jerry Seinfeld bit where he goes, wherever there are women, we have men looking into it. He's talking about like dating. That just feels like wherever is land, there are data center people looking into it. Like,
absolutely.
And you can see from some of the announcements like where those recent purchases are, and they're just so distributed that groups are really getting creative and kind of scouring kind of the earth, really, for lack of a better term. Even actually space too. Check out our last podcast. People are looking in space. Can I get 100 acres in space? I guess. I'm nothing you can do there.
But I think too, you've got to, if you're going to go that route with like alternative energy solutions, I mean, you got to realize there's like 10 to 15 companies that are moving the needle here. There's not 100. There's not 500. This is a different world, and so you have to make sure that those 10 to 15 are going to buy into what that alternative energy solution is. Does that meet their sustainability plans? How are they going to justify using that, energy? Is that a bridge solution? Can you, transfer off of it over time? I mean, there's a number of things you have to consider before that. Plus, typically those solutions are going in like secondary and tertiary markets. So, if you finance, if you put together a site in the middle of nowhere for 300 megawatts, and at some point that big user leaves, there's only a list of 10 to 12 that are going to come, that are going to be potential options to replace that. And the market could change. And so I think, the secondary and tertiary markets solve a challenge. So if you have powered land in these areas, it's certainly, a valuable thing to figure out, but I think you just got to go in with like eyes wide open. It's one of the reasons that like in some of these areas, you're seeing some very established players, very established co-location operators, as well as hyperscale users that are going out and they're developing the land. And there's ways to do this with the data center operators understand how to deploy capital really well. So they know when it's time to, spend the money to order the power equipment, substations, the things you need to do in advance. They know when to pull the trigger there. Yeah. They know when it's time to go vertical. They know when it's time to go spec and when it's not. And so I think that just making sure you're aware of what that looks like. The other thing too is now that the power companies realize that there's such a squeeze on the utility power across the country, they're asking more. They've had to figure out, hey, if I have 50 new projects that have come in over the last quarter, I've got to figure out what's real and what's not. Yep. And so what's the best way to do that? Okay, now I'm going to ask you to pay money for us to go do do
paperwork.
That's right. The site surveys the study plans to figure out how we do this. And that will kind of push a number of people out.
I think it makes it that much harder to even flip land. So there's a funny story. Somebody told me this was probably 3 or 4 years ago, that I think it's Cyrus One has got a site up in Washington, and they have I think it's a will serve letter. I'm probably getting the terminology wrong, from the power company with no expiration date on it.
Yeah.
And it's like 30 megawatts. And the person who was telling me the story was like, there's no way that power provider would do that deal now.
Sure.
And so with the kind of increasing responsibility on the developer to go kind of use it or lose it, that makes it even harder to flip land. So even if you're, again, established developer, you have the relationships with the operators, you have the relationships with the equipment manufacturers, the developers, everything you need.
Yep.
You still have like this very tight needle to thread between getting the power secured, then getting the tenant to buy in, and then getting the thing developed, all within this increasingly tighter time frames that the power companies are putting on the developers. So that makes it just makes it very much more challenging to be a kind of pure play powered land developer. I hope the term land flipper is not derogatory, but that kind of is what it is. You're buying unpowered land, getting the power, and then trying to sell it for a profit.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's getting harder to do.
Yeah, and I don't think it's I don't think it's a bad thing for the power companies to be, trying to weed out what's real and what's not, because it's creating, in some ways it creates some false views of what the future demand looks like. I'll give you a good example. There was a power company, I think, that, said, hey, we've got demand for 15 or 18 gigawatts. And I think in kind of one of the anecdotes, they mentioned a story where they're like, we had a hyperscaler come to us with, a project on a Monday, 400 megawatts. By Wednesday, we had 4 or 5 developers come to us with projects for 400 megawatts. And so they're going, okay, now we have like 2 gigawatts of requests.
Yeah.
And we really think there's like one 400 megawatt requirement out of that. And so that's what they're having to figure out is, and the hyperscalers are trying to figure out, hey, should we do this ourselves or should we use our partners?
Yeah, sure.
And so they're hedging their, bets related to like, hey, what's the best way we should approach this? So we need to go figure out, hey, which of these 4 partners or whatever have sites that we could use, but we also know that we could do it ourselves. And so the power company is put in a really tough spot to figure out like what is the real requirement here.
Yeah.
And so I think that's certainly one of the reasons you're seeing them kind of put these like gates up and going like, hey, if we're going to take the next step, it's going to cost more.
You know what we call that in college?
Tell me, Mike.
DTR. You got to define the relationship.
That's right.
Hey, where do we stand? Are we dating? Are we not? We're going to get engaged, or are we not? And I think power companies, to their credit, have gotten smarter on that.
Yeah.
Hey, a good relationship is founded on good communication.
There you go.
Clearly set expectations.
Man.
So as hard as this has gotten, I'm all over the board today, David.
No,
this
is what you get on this podcast,
yeah,
man.
I know.
It's like life advice.
Data center, real estate market intelligence, and relationship
That's
advice
right.
on a global platform through our team.
Jeez.
So as hard as it's gotten,
yes,
the rewards are still very great for those who can pull this off successfully. Yeah. So I know you and your team have done a lot of work trying to get a good sense of kind of the cost differential between unpowered land and powered land.
Yes,
and in general, some of the trends around land. We used to say land was a rounding error. Not the case anymore. Even unpowered land has gotten so expensive that it's not a rounding error. But talk about some of the differences in cost or value between kind of powered land and unpowered land.
Well, Mike, you're on the team too, so it's our team that has gone out and figured. I mean, historically, land costs in these rural markets would be, $20,000 an acre, $30,000 an acre, all the way up to maybe like 75 to 100. This is a long time ago. And just depending on where you were, would determine the cost. And when the data center requirements came back to the bigger cities, that really started, this is like 2014, 2020, that changed the pricing, not significantly, but enough. And in areas like Northern Virginia, that's where we really started to see people are, if you're listening this far in, to the 3 people that are, if you remember,
hi, David's mom.
You remember when God, such a terrible, she probably is listening.
She's probably going to comment now too.
Hi, Mom, how's it going?
Swing by the office, bring us some cookies.
That's right. But like in Northern Virginia, like when land got to above $1 million an acre, that was a really,
that was actually, I think maybe
deal.
Since I joined the company,
that's right.
2019, and that was like,
that was a huge deal.
7 figs.
Yes, thank you. And
you bet.
And that, obviously shifted to now where it was like 3 million, 4 million. And there's certain areas in Northern Virginia now where it's not that much, but it's certainly more expensive than it's been. But now, if you can take, we have seen land purchased for X, and then, the power story, over a year, 18-month period gets better. They figure out, they get the site zone, they get, power, the pathway of power there, and then probably the PPA signed with the power company. And now you've got, a 4 times, 5 times, sale opportunity on that. So
yeah, that's a really important point. Like the difference between unpowered land and powered land, we're seeing about a 4 to 5x difference in price.
Yeah, in certain areas for sure. So I think that's where people get really excited. If you think in the kind of this, this is if this is like a gold rush. This is where the speculating is happening. This is where everybody's trying to figure out like, hey, how do I get this for X and sell it for 2, 3, 4, 5x? That just doesn't happen in like traditional real estate. Like there are deals that, take place, but with land, it's a very hard thing to accomplish. So, and you can do that in some ways. You could, previously without having to put up as much capital as, potentially having to build powered shells or doing things like from a vertical perspective. So that's where, certainly the opportunity is, and it's getting more challenging and more challenging. I think there's people that have made announcements that will not complete what they will not do what they have said because it's going to cost too much. It's going to take too long, and they don't have the stomach for it. This is a long. I remember Mark Gansey talking about like AI, and he was like saying like, hey, this is a long game. To watch this technology play out and how the world uses it, how businesses will interact with AI. It's like the iterations of this are going to take a long time to figure out. And so it's hard to come in, for a year or two and get out. And that's just a tough, investor thesis in our world.
Yeah.
So if you're not, I think if there's groups listening and you're going, hey, we're not in this for 3 to 5 years, it's probably not a great market to, invest in or play in. Yeah. But it has attracted a lot more interest for sure.
Yeah. One thing I should have noticed earlier, but just noticed this morning, is that Dallas is now the #1 market in the U.S. from a planned power standpoint, which is one of the metrics we track. And that just goes to show, like, of all those different dynamics we just talked about, one of the areas that's still pretty friendly to that type of development is Dallas.
Is that right?
In the North Texas market.
Okay, cool.
So I don't know if you caught that, but
I did.
A lot of times we're kind of like in the weeds with some of the data we're producing. We don't pull back up, but
that's good.
That's a really interesting note around specifically around Powerland. And I would say that doesn't include some of the very recent announcements that were made that were very significant developments in the North Texas area that I think we're still trying to vet and understand the kind of true scope of.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good thing to bring up. In our data, the way we look at the market is our methodology is like commissioned, available, under construction, planned, like those 4 buckets from a power perspective as we look at the co-location market. And that planned category, historically in most major data center markets in the US, it'd be like 200 megs, 300 megs, 400 megs. And that's multiple projects, multiple sites from data center operators that they had bought, and they're going to do a 36 meg building here or 72 megs here. Those numbers have gone from that, to your point, like
Dallas is over 6 gigs now.
Yeah, like 1.6 gigs, 3 gigs, whatever. And so the important thing to note there is that if you take that 6 gigawatt number, if I was to just look at that, I bet there's 2 gigawatts of that or 2 to 3 gigawatts that the group that probably is out with it isn't the group that's going to actually do it. Because of some of the challenges that they will face along the way. And again, I haven't looked at that breakdown. So as you look at those planned powered numbers, that's a really important thing to evaluate. Is like, how much of this do we think is real, and how much of that do we think is like speculation? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not like casting a negative light on that. I'm just saying, that part of if you're going to go invest hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in these projects and in these markets, you really got to know what is the landscape and what's real and what's not. Because that's going to be the world that you're in for the next 5 to 10 years on these deals. So
and that's what we're obviously focused on kind of day in, day out around here. So
I think this is a really big topic, and it's important, and it's not just big in the U.S. It's big other places, but it's front and center right now in the U.S. because the demand signals here are so high when compared to like Europe or APAC or Latin America. There's those demand signals, but there's different reasons why they're more challenging in this country than they are over here, or this area has a moratorium and this one doesn't. So there's just different things that they've focused on the last couple of weeks. I think the U.S. government has kind of said, hey, we're open for business. And that I think has triggered a lot more interest. So this is a topic that it's important if you're in the space to understand. If you're a consultant, there's a lot of opportunities to help people understand the market. If you're a vendor, if I serve data centers, one of the things I'd be trying to do is figure out, hey, how do I position my sales force, my business, to do these requirements? Like where geographically, where do I need to be? We were at PTC, as we've talked about multiple times on this podcast, a couple weeks ago, and one of the people that we met with was saying that one of the projects that is being worked on in West Texas has to get labor from 7 states to complete the project. So, if you're so you really have to plan well to understand where this is going to happen, so that you've got, a workforce in place that can,
as this development you talked about, it spreads to more and more rural areas, that's going to be a challenge.
That's right.
And it's going to drive the cost of development. And maybe the timing. So just something to be aware of.
Yeah. And I think if you're like an investor looking at the market, just understanding the landscape, data center operators in this world every day, but just really trying to like put a quick framework around the market so that you can understand, does it make sense to go spend, $500 million into this fund or $1 billion or $4 billion, whatever it is. The numbers are crazy today, but
500 billion.
Yeah. So
Stargate.
That's
Stargate's another podcast, but anyways, as always, David, great thoughts.
Hey, thank you.
But if you're not aware, which I'm assuming everyone is because they're on this channel, but some of the podcasts we've done in the past have touched on this.
Yes.
It's always interesting to see like the evolution of this, how it's evolved. I think the site selection one you did with Brant was a good one.
Yeah.
To go back and watch.
Yeah. In fact, somebody asked me, somebody was LinkedInning me. Is that a
I don't know what the verb form of that is.
You would say
I would say they messaged me on LinkedIn. I would just not try and shorten that.
But I don't see they messaged me
on
text.
LinkedIn. No, they message you on LinkedIn.
Okay, anyway.
LinkedIn.
I was messaged on LinkedIn by somebody who basically was asking about like site selection and, so there, to your point, there's a very good podcast, Brant Burnett, and I worked with Brant at CBRE a long time ago, and he's got some really good, great anecdotes on how to do it right, what the pitfalls
Brant's
are.
just cool.
He is cool.
I mean, he's an easy listen.
I know, and I've told him before if there's a Brant Burnett not fan club, but he writes stuff and sings music, I'm one of the first people to sign up.
He's a great dude.
That's right.
Anyway, check that out. And again, all the other content we've put out, we hope is helpful, including this one today, but also datacenterhawk.com. As always, tons of resources there as well. So we will catch you next time.